Okay, shall we start? You want to let everybody in, Joe? Hello, everyone. My name is Usama Fayyad. I'm the Executive Director at the Institute for Experiential AI at Northeastern University. And welcome to another seminar in our Distinguished Lecture seminar series. Today, we are privileged to have a special guest, and we apologize in advance because I think we had a bit of a snafu, which led to the delayed start here of this talk. I think we didn't send the full information to our speaker, our fault. But we are very lucky to have Jenna Wiens from the University of Michigan, Computer Science and Engineering. She is the head of the Machine Learning and Data-Driven Decisions Research Group, and she has been working for since her PhD actually at MIT on issues of at the intersection of machine learning and healthcare. I had the pleasure to hear Jenna speak before about some pretty powerful applications with Michigan Hospital and other places. So really great experiences. Jenna received her PhD in 2014 from MIT and has received many honors. Most recently, she was selected a 2020 Sloan Research Fellow in Computer Science. So due to the late start, I would like to, of course, turn it over to our speaker. Welcome, Jenna, and thank you for doing this talk.
Great, and thank you so much for inviting me to this seminar series. I'm really excited to be here to tell you about our work in augmenting clinical decision-making with AI. And I'm happy to take questions throughout the talk. So if you have questions that arise, feel free to throw them in the chat, and I'll do my best to try to stay on top of things. All right, so to get started, let's start with some context or some framing. In hospitals, we're collecting just an immense amount of patient data today. So everything from diagnoses and medications to now information on genomics and wearables and imaging and notes. And in my research group, we develop and we use machine learning techniques that can identify patterns in these data, patterns that can be used to sort patients from low risk to high risk for a particular adverse event or adverse outcome, or match patients to appropriate treatments with the ultimate goal of augmenting clinical practice and improving patient care. And given the challenges that today's healthcare systems are facing, there's a critical need for such clinical decision support systems. So what are the problems? Well, one, currently the demand for clinical care far exceeds the supply, and economists had anticipated this shortfall even prior to the pandemic, but the pandemic has just accelerated this issue. And this shortage exacerbates what's already a serious issue in the field, and that's physician burnout. So today, when I talk to my colleagues in medicine, they often cite the increasing computerization of the field as a problem rather than a solution. Clinicians are spending a lot of time entering data about their patients while still ignoring the vast majority of it. And this burnout, combined with a lack of tools to make sense of all the data, has contributed to a large number of medical errors. So a study published in the British Medical Journal in 2016 highlighted medical errors as the third leading contributor to death in the US. And these issues highlight an important need, but also an opportunity for AI in health. And in my research group, we work across a number of different disease domains, from diagnosis and risk stratification of healthcare associated infections, acute respiratory failure, to Alzheimer's disease, to treatments for things like sepsis, and disease management for patients with type 1 diabetes. And in all of these projects, we collaborate closely with clinicians who can help guide us and keep us on track. Make sure that we're solving the problems that matter. And in all of these projects, our goal is to augment rather than replace clinicians. And when people talk about augmentation, they often talk about the shortcomings or limitations of the human and how we want to augment them with these models. I like to think of it the other way, where the models are limited. Models can make mistakes. Models rarely are able to capture all of the nuances of a complex clinical situation. So we need clinicians to augment these models. So I think it really goes both ways. And in today's talk, I'm going to describe 3 projects along these lines. The first focuses on augmentation in the context of making diagnoses, while the second presents a novel clinician in the loop framework for selecting treatments. And the final project is some of the work that we have been doing in response to the surges that we have seen in the hospital to address some of the shortfalls and limitations of care in the context of COVID-19. All right. So let's consider the first project, where the task here is diagnosing patients who present with acute respiratory failure. So there are several underlying causes of acute respiratory failure, the 3 most common being heart failure, pneumonia, and COPD, or chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder. But it's estimated that in up to 30% of cases, physicians make an incorrect initial diagnosis. So in making that incorrect initial diagnosis, a patient can receive incorrect treatment that could actually lead to more harm than good. So if we were able to build a model that could aid a clinician in making a correct diagnosis earlier on, this could lead to improved patient outcomes. So we looked at using deep learning, specifically deep learning applied to chest x-rays, to build a model that could predict the probability that a patient has pneumonia, the probability that a patient has COPD, and the probability that a patient has heart failure. And here the probabilities don't sum to 1 because you could have any combination of these particular diagnoses or none of them. So in our study population, we considered roughly 1,300 patients admitted to Michigan Medicine from 2017 to 2018, and we included patients who developed acute respiratory failure. So these are patients who need supplemental oxygen. The outcome, so their diagnosis of COPD, CHF, and pneumonia was reviewed independently by at least 2 physicians. So we did chart review, and it was a consensus-based diagnosis where we had each physician scale patients or score patients on a scale of 1 to 4 for each of these 3 diagnoses. And then these scores were averaged and thresholded. So early on in this project, we were using computer vision techniques to map chest x-rays to the probability of these diagnoses. And the models were doing pretty well. But when we looked into what the models were learning, things looked weird. Not weird to us necessarily, but weird to our clinical collaborators. So when we showed some of the activation maps, like I'm showing you here on the right, what the model is looking at to make its predictions for, say, a diagnosis of heart failure, the radiologist started shaking her head. She said, no way, this model doesn't make any sense. We as radiologists are trained to look at the heart when we're making a diagnosis of CHF. And instead, what we see this model, so the yellow is showing you where the model is looking. It's looking at things like breast tissue, in bone structure, differences that arise across female and males. And that's the problem with these approaches, is that if your data are unexpectedly skewed in such a way, for example, that more males experience the outcome than females or vice versa, then the model can end up learning and taking advantage of the shortcut, right? Instead of learning what makes a patient have heart failure, or clinically relevant radiological findings of heart failure on a chest radiograph or chest x-ray, the model just learns female or male. And this has been shown in other computer vision related tasks, not related to healthcare. So if you have a model that's, for example, trained to recognize cows, it can fail if the cow shows up in an unexpected place, because instead of learning what makes a cow, you've learned to recognize the green background. And this presents a serious issue in healthcare, since models can learn to perpetuate or even exacerbate human biases in clinical care. So in the context of learning to diagnose based on chest x-rays, we sought to identify which potential shortcuts could be exploited by these deep models. So first we started with the question of, can we recognize female or not? And we had some evidence that we could do this, but if it's still a difficult task, so if the AURC is still fairly close to random, then it might not be such a shortcut. When we looked at the ability of a model to discern female or not based on a chest x-ray alone across 3 different data sets. So here I've got the Michigan data in the first column, data from Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center in the second column, and data from Checkspert data set from Stanford in the third column. And I'm showing you the area under the receiver operating characteristic curve, or the measure of discriminative performance for this task of female or not. And we see that even on a very small data set by computer vision standards, so remember at Michigan, we only had roughly 1,300 images, and we have to split that into training, validation, and test, we get very good discriminative performance, nearly 1. Compared to Mimic and Checkspert, where we have hundreds of thousands of images, it's trivial. The model can perfectly distinguish female from not based on a chest x-ray. And we found that these trends were also present for other sensitive attributes. So while it was slightly more difficult to discern age greater than 65 or not based on a chest x-ray, there was still a signal there. And we also found signals for body mass index, for race, and for treatments, indicators of treatments, like a pacemaker. And this really creates a problem because if a model ends up taking any of these shortcuts, so if any of these sensitive attributes or even treatment is spuriously correlated with the diagnosis, with the outcome of interest, then as soon as we shift to another population, another institution where this correlation no longer holds, the model can fail to generalize because it's learned to just rely on a shortcut. And this has been shown in other settings as well. I think this is a really common problem in machine learning for healthcare. There was a paper that was published last year in Nature Machine Intelligence that showed several attempts of diagnosing COVID-19 from chest x-rays were flawed. And in particular, one study trained the algorithm on infection-free images taken from scans of children and compared them to positive scans from adults, resulting in a tool that could basically just tell you the difference between children and adults rather than who has the disease and who doesn't. And the potential of these shortcuts could lead to not only poor generalization performance, but also bias amplification, in which human biases, where, for example, I might be less likely to diagnose female patients with congestive heart failure, could be replicated or amplified by a model. And while shortcuts based on age, gender, and race are particularly worrisome, there are other sources of shortcuts that can be detrimental when it comes to model performance. And here I'm showing you two chest x-rays from the same individual, except for one small difference. And I challenge you to identify the difference between these two images. Any guesses? You can put your guesses in the chat if you want. I'll give you a couple of seconds to compare these. No guesses? No one spotted the difference? One guess. Let me pull it up. I can't tell. Very hard to say. My eyes are only human. They seem equal to me as well. So we're doing this over Zoom. Everyone's looking at this on a different monitor. In the past, when I've given this talk, some people have noticed slight differences in what they think is the aspect ratio or the brightness. Both images are identical except for the pre-processing that has been applied. So in both cases, we, during a pre-processing step, apply Gaussian filter that helps smooth out some of the image. The one on the left has a Gaussian filter that has a standard deviation of 0.4, and the one on the right uses a Gaussian filter with a standard deviation of 0.5. To date, no one has been able to identify that difference, but when we looked at to what extent a model could tell the difference between these two images, it again was trivial. It could do so with near perfect discriminative performance. And this is particularly concerning because we don't often, or we don't always report the pre-processing steps in our machine learning pipelines. We focus a lot on what we did during training, how we evaluated the model, but not always how we curated the data. And if we had, say, two large data sets, like the mimic data set and the Chexpert data set, and we pooled them together, if there are different pre-processing pipelines and there are different rates or incidences of disease or outcomes in those two populations, then a model can exploit that shortcut in pre-processing, and it can learn just to distinguish one type of pre-processing from another rather than actually learning clinically relevant radiological findings that we would expect to generalize. So given that it's possible for models to exploit such shortcuts, we sought to develop techniques that could mitigate or prevent a model from taking such shortcuts. And specifically, we investigated a simple transfer learning approach based on how clinicians reuse common features across diseases. So from talking with our clinical collaborators, when they're trained to look for different radiological findings, it's across diseases. So in short, we want to encourage the model to rely on clinically relevant features that are more likely to generalize across populations. So in our setup, we aim to solve some target tasks. So for example, diagnose congestive heart failure, but we assume that we have only a very small, potentially very biased training set. And if we were to leverage just this training set, then we would almost surely end up learning shortcuts based on these biases, and we would fail to generalize. So to address this issue, we assume access to some related but curated source task, a data set that shares similar features. So for example, we might have a data set that we've curated and we've labeled with respect to a diagnosis of pneumonia. And we want to leverage this in some way so that we can do better on the target task of predicting congestive heart failure. So our approach is two-stage. We first learn a model. In this case, this is a dense net composed of an encoder E and a linear layer F. And we first train on the source task. So in our earlier example, this is just predicting pneumonia. And then in the second stage, we're going to freeze the encoder and we're going to update just the weights associated with the last or output layer of the model based on our target task. So now we swap out the data set for the congestive heart failure data set. Again, this is potentially very, very biased data set. But because we've frozen these layers here, it's essentially extracting the features, extracting the clinically relevant radiological findings. And then this last layer is just about learning to reweight them with respect to the task that we care about. And we are not claiming to have invented transfer learning. This is a well-known approach. However, we were surprised at how effective it was in this particular case in terms of mitigating shortcuts. And here I'm showing you some of our empirical results where we have a training set in which we want to diagnose patients with congestive heart failure or not. And there's a strong correlation with age being greater than 65. Now, when we just train on the biased training set, we see that when we test on an out of distribution sample data in which this correlation doesn't hold, the performance is very close to 0.5. So here again, I'm showing you the area under the receiver operating characteristic curve with 95% confidence intervals. This is again when there's a strong bias or correlation in which those greater than the age of 65 are more likely to have the outcome in the training set, but not in the test set. So this is performance on the test set. When we leverage an auxiliary task, a source task like pneumonia, to first learn clinically relevant features and then retrain that last layer in the approach that I showed you, the performance improves significantly. And we see the same trend regardless of the type of bias present in the data. So while transfer learning is a well-explored area, we still think it's a somewhat surprising result that the last layer simultaneously has the capacity to learn an accurate or an expressive model, but not enough capacity to overfit to this bias. So you can find the full set of results in our MLHC paper. You can find all of the code online if you would like to replicate our findings. We have a team that worked and contributed on this project. I'd like to highlight in particular the graduate student, Sarah Jabour, who is a PhD candidate in my group. The two clinical collaborators, Michael Shoding, who's a pulmonary critical care physician at Michigan Medicine, and Ella Kazaruni, who's a radiologist at Michigan Medicine, and my colleague, David Foey, who's an expert in computer vision here in computer science and engineering at Michigan. All right, so takeaways here. Deep learning can classify demographics, treatments, like whether or not a patient has a pacemaker. And when the training data are skewed or biased such that these sensitive attributes correlate with the outcome, but this correlation doesn't hold, the shortcuts can be exploited, and this can lead to poor generalization performance. Transfer learning, surprisingly effective, but beyond computational approaches to mitigate shortcuts, we're now looking into a combination of human-based strategies along with these computational approaches, measuring to what extent humans can pick up on bias models that are erroneously relying on shortcuts. And I think it's this collaboration that will be most effective in improving the generalizability of models across populations, across institutions, and across time. All right, so moving on to the second part of the talk, we're going to shift gears from diagnosis to treatment. And this is something that I hear my clinical collaborators say all the time. High quality patient care means delivering the right treatment to the right patient at the right time. So here, instead of focusing on mapping patient states to the probability of the outcome, we aim to identify the best sequence of actions or treatments in terms of downstream consequences. And I'm just going to pause. I see a question in the chat. Can you please speak more about the experiment setup where the radiologists were asked to diagnose? The slides show a mobile interface with a very small display. Is that what was used for testing? Could the small space have affected radiologist performance? Great question. So that was all from pilot data. This study now that we're running to collect data to probe the hypothesis of whether or not clinicians can recover from this bias if given the right explanations, is about to launch across the US. We're hoping to recruit over 300 clinicians for this study. There we have specific instructions that we would like them to do the survey on a computer screen. So it can work on a mobile phone, but as you pointed out, it's going to be a lot easier to see the chest x-ray on a big screen. So that was an important consideration that we have, but it's a Qualtrics-based survey. And we've had a few different updates or improvements to the interface based on follow-up pilot studies with clinicians and radiologists here. And we go beyond just radiologists as well. That's the plan. So that's yet to be collected data in unpublished work. No problem. I'm happy to take questions. It's reassuring that there's someone on the other end listening to me. All right, so going back, so we're shifting gears here away from just trying to estimate the outcome to actually selecting the best sequence of treatment to optimize for some outcomes. So for example, the probability of survival. And here we're going to consider a reinforcement learning setup. So at each time step T, the agent perceives some state, S sub T, selects an action, A sub T, and receives a reward, R sub T plus 1, before transitioning to the next state. And here, the overall goal is to identify a policy pi that is a mapping from state to action that maximizes cumulative reward. And in terms of our problem setting in healthcare, this perceived state could correspond to, for example, different vital sign measurements of a patient. The actions here would correspond to treatments, for example, the selection of medications or doses. And here I'm emphasizing the term sequence because the action or treatment that I select now influences not only the next state, but also all possible future states, future treatments or actions, decisions I might want to make, and thus future rewards. And this reward is one of the biggest challenges in this RL setup. Well, it can be rather straightforward to come up with a state definition for an individual and the set of actions for a particular task. what should we optimize for is often a contentious question. Should we optimize for long-term quality of life or the short-term stabilization of vitals? What if I'm willing to undergo a more invasive treatment over taking a drug that might have negative side effects, but you're not? So designing a single reward function that captures the goals and objectives across many individuals is challenging. And in our conversations with clinicians, we couldn't even get clinicians to agree, let alone patients. The cardiologist wanted to optimize for one thing. The pulmonologist wanted to optimize for another thing. And while there's been some work on augmenting rewards via reward shaping, oftentimes what researchers in healthcare will default to for a reward is survival. And we could get the clinicians to agree on that if the patient survives the hospital visit, it's a good thing. And if they don't survive the hospital visit, it's a bad thing. And this is very easy to define. It's present in a lot of data sets. And it's typically limited with respect to how much noise there is in the signal. But using survival as a reward is likely to induce many near equivalent actions. So what do I mean by this? Well, if I give you 500 milliliters of fluids versus 750 milliliters of fluids, it's probably going to lead to more or less the same outcome with respect to survival. But the issue here is that standard reinforcement learning algorithms will ignore these near equivalent actions, and it will simply present you with the best action. But in reality, there could be many actions that lead to a similar outcome with respect to survival, but differ due to a variety of factors that we might have difficulty quantifying or accounting for in a reward. And it remains challenging to define a universal reward that captures the goals of different individuals, not to mention the fact that over time, the goals of an individual could change. So recognizing these challenges, instead of trying to come up with a better reward function, we reformulated the problem. Okay, so instead of learning a mapping from each state to a single best action, we aim to learn a mapping from each state to a set of near equivalent actions. And this presents the patient or care team with a set of good choices while optimizing for survival. And then in turn, individuals, care teams can incorporate their own rewards and preferences that might be otherwise difficult to quantify. I see the question related to the Qualtrics study. I'll come back to that at the end, just so that I can finish up this section. So our goal here is to learn a mapping from each state to a set of near equivalent actions. So now this pie, our policy, instead of mapping S to A, is going to map S to a set, a non-empty set of actions. And just to kind of help you all wrap your head around this with an analogy, let's pretend we're in a grid world, as we often do in reinforcement learning, where we are in some starting state S, and we want to get to some goal state G. And this is a frozen lake environment. The goal here is don't fall through the ice. So we want to get from S to G without falling into any black holes. Well, instead of identifying the single best route, which is what a standard RL algorithm would do, a set valued policy will map each state to multiple near equivalent actions, thereby finding multiple routes to navigate the world while achieving a cumulative reward that's close to the optimal value. So why is this challenging? Right? Learning near equivalent actions, it might seem straightforward, but the sequential nature, remember this emphasis that I put earlier on this sequence of treatments, makes this more difficult because our choice of action Okay, so the action that we choose here influences not only the immediate reward and the next state, but all future states and potential reward. So for two actions to be considered near equivalent, they have to be similar not only in the short term, but similar in the long term. So they have to lead to similar futures. And we don't necessarily know what the agent is going to choose in the future. So that's what makes this problem hard. However, I think it's an incredibly applicable framework, right? I think patients and clinicians could benefit from this type of choice, constrained choice, in selecting treatments. But despite the potential applicability here, there was relatively limited work on learning these sorts of set value policies. So when we went back and we looked at the literature, because we thought surely someone has already done this, we had to go way back to work by Fard and Pinot from 2009 and 2011. And they proposed an approach that required knowledge of the environment. So you needed the model of the environment, the MDP, and it relied on an exhaustive search over all state action pairs. And in many healthcare settings, one, we don't know the environment, so we're interested in a model-free setting, and two, we have perhaps a continuous state space and can't rely on an exhaustive search. So in light of these limitations, we proposed a new algorithm for learning these near optimal set value policies that apply in model-free settings and can be solved efficiently without an exhaustive search. And we refer to this as clinician or human in the loop decision-making. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over the algorithm, but you can find the details in our ICML paper. The algorithm is based on Q-learning, and like Q-learning, the algorithm's off policy and it doesn't require a model of the environment. And I'm going to jump ahead or skip ahead to some of our results. So specifically, we considered the task of learning to treat patients with sepsis. And this has been a task that others have explored in the literature. And we sought to empirically study how does this approach work in kind of this real world setting with real world data. What kinds of policies or near equivalencies does it identify in the data? So here we're using data from MIMIC, that's data from the Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. These are all tabular data, so they're data pertaining to physiological variables extracted from the electronic health records, so things like vitals. And we're trying to optimize, again, for survival. Where we have a population of roughly 20,000 individuals. They all have sepsis, and we want to identify a sequence of treatments that could improve the probability of survival. And here, the treatment decisions are essentially broken up into a 25 discrete action space where we have 5 different levels of fluids and 5 different doses of vasopressors. So to investigate the applicability of our approach, we looked at what our algorithm identified as near equivalent. So here we're visualizing action near equivalence in a 5x5 grid. So along the x-axis here, we have vasopressor dose, and along the y-axis here, we have the IV fluid dose. And it ranges from 0 to over 2 liters. This is every 4 hours. And the vasopressor dose ranges between 0 and greater than 0.45, which is a large dose of vasopressors, IV vasopressors. And then here, I'm showing you within each of these grids, one, the corresponding action, and then those that are considered near equivalent. Okay, so let's zoom in on one of these. So this particular block here, where we have no vasopressors given and a low dose of IV fluids. And what we see is that when a low dose of IV fluids is the optimal action, this action is always included. And 35% of the time, no IV fluids is considered near equivalent. And when I say 37% of the time here, I'm marginalizing over all states. So remember, the near equivalencies would actually depend on states. So I'm looking at across all states, how many times is that no IV fluids dose considered near equivalent when IV fluid dose of 1 to 500 milliliters was considered optimal. And then in the rest of the time, we see that there's a sort of decreasing trend where more increasing amounts of fluids are considered near equivalent. So it really depends what state we'll be in. But to further interpret these results, we worked really closely with our co-author, Dr. Michael Schoeding, a critical care physician at Michigan Medicine, who frequently treats patients with sepsis. And he helped us make sense of the data. So first, starting with what we see here on the left-hand side, where there's essentially no vasopressors given, but varying amounts of IV fluids, we see these sort of bands in the left-hand column. And this suggests that similar doses of IV fluids are considered near equivalent, which he reassured us made sense clinically. And we see the same sort of thing when low doses of IV fluids are used. Similar doses of vasopressors are considered near equivalent. So we start to see these horizontal bands here. But what was really interesting when we looked at these results is what was happening up here in the right-hand corner, where the optimal action was do everything, right? A high dose of vasopressors, a high dose of IV fluids, and the most frequent near equivalent action was the do nothing action. No vasopressors, no IV fluids. And while this was really puzzling to us when we spoke with Dr. Schoeding, he said that this is not that far off from clinical care, where in many cases you can do everything, you can do nothing, and it can lead to similarly bad outcomes when the patient is very sick. So takeaways or summary from this section: we proposed a new algorithm for learning near optimal set valued policies. And the idea here is to provide good options to care teams, to individuals, while giving them flexibility in their choice. And I think that while this was all motivated from the context of healthcare, there's potential broader impact to other applications beyond healthcare, for example, education settings. So if you want to start learning your set valued policies today, you can do so by going to our GitLab website and working with our code. I want to highlight the two students that worked on this project, Shengpu Tang and Aditya Modi, and my clinical collaborator, Dr. Michael Schoeding. All right, so we have 8 minutes, time check, 8 minutes for questions. Is that right?
Yeah, perfect, Jenna. Thank you for a great talk, and the part of bias was very interesting for me. So there are some questions in the chat that are not answered yet, so
Okay, I can go through those. I think that what I'm hearing is that we should definitely jump straight to questions. So I'm just going to skip over this last piece. If you want to learn about what we did, you can reach out, or we have a paper that was published in the British Medical Journal just last month. And I'm just going to skip to my very last slide with the takeaways here. That tell us about how models make mistakes, models cannot perfectly capture all the nuances of a situation. So it's important to, one, think about those mistakes and how to mitigate them, and novel frameworks for facilitating decision-making. But the most important thing to take into account is developing machine learning for healthcare in collaboration with the people who will use it. So I just want to end by acknowledging all of the clinical collaborators who helped us in these projects, all of the students who really led these projects, and the funding sources. And now I'm happy to jump to questions.
I think the first unanswered question is from Dennis Parra, that is asking if you report to physicians the probability of the softmax or just the predicted diagnosis.
Yes. So we went back and forth on this a lot. And we ended up presenting the continuous probability, but also giving clear thresholds. So sort of what clinicians are used to seeing is this kind of red, yellow, green bar. And we have in the updated version a user interface that displays that kind of red, yellow, green threshold thresholds and where the patient falls. So it's still a continuous scale, but we've hinted at the discrete. And we did this, and we also introduced some noise in the confidence or the output of the probability of the model, so as not to bias the clinician, because oftentimes when a model is biased, it will be very, very certain, and that could actually be a hint to that certainty. And we really wanted to probe the question of, are the explanations helping? So yeah, that's a great question. There's so many interesting questions that arose in just the design of the user study. There were many pilots, so I'm excited that we're going to actually deploy this.
There are also some studies in justice that show that judges also believe more in the predictions, and then they have kind of a bias towards the expert that is the system. So the next question is by Paolo. It's about the reinforcement learning approach. And he asked, how do you acquire the experimental data required to train this model, or maybe to start? Because I guess you don't have training data, but you have some initial assumptions on how to treat patients, right?
So we do have training data. So this is a great question. This is an offline reinforcement learning setting. So
it's offline, okay.
Yeah,
That's
so
important.
we're not, and that's often the case in healthcare. It's not ethical to go and explore the space of treatment options in a real healthcare online setting. So we're relying on there being enough exploration in the retrospective data that we've collected over the last decade or so in how physicians treat patients who look very similar, but actually end up receiving different treatments. But yeah, this is an offline setting.
But then with new data, you train the model again, the offline reinforcement learning, if you have new data, for example, after using it?
So you can retrain, yeah, as you collect new data. In this setting, we have the retrospective data. We train on the retrospective data, and then I didn't show these results, but we use off-policy evaluation techniques to evaluate the learned policy in a validation set. And we actually have a paper from last year that addressed how to do this kind of model selection and using off-policy evaluation techniques, because it's not straightforward. It's not as simple as in the supervised learning setting. Great questions.
Okay. Then you have a question from Larry Lefkowitz that says, diagnosis. There seems to be an assumption that the model and the clinicians are using the same cues and methodologies to reach their conclusions. So at the end, if you can read that.
Seems to be assumption that the model and clinicians are, when successfully, using roughly the same cues and methodologies. This assumption allows the model to evoke feedback from clinicians by highlighting what data it's focusing on, at least and from accepting corrections, have you found that models are generally more successful by emulating human diagnostic or by leveraging aspects of data or relationships? So I think that is in part what our results showed in the chest X-ray work. So they're more likely to generalize and be more robust to changes, I think, to the extent that you can emulate. And I'm not saying perfectly emulate, because there could be unknown, yet undiscovered factors that could contribute to the diagnosis that might be subtle to the human eye. But we know that a clinician can go from one health system to another and their performance doesn't tank. So we would like to replicate that robustness across models as well.
Yeah, so would you say that basically machines make mistakes that humans don't do and vice versa?
In an ideal world, that would be the case, because then we could fill in the gaps going both ways. I think that there are probably still some cases where neither the model nor the human can necessarily address those gaps with the data we currently have.
Yeah, of course, but I'm saying that basically they are not contained in each other, the sets.
I think that there is there will be some overlap, but I think there are some areas where there isn't overlap, and that's where I see potential.
Yeah, so I think the last question is from Jean Tunick, that maybe you can read it. Your English is better than mine.
Yeah, sure. The model is currently optimized for a binary outcome, survive or not survive. In most clinical decisions, the choice is more complex. This will obviously increase model complexity. Is there a balance between keeping more model complexity manageable while still having the model output decisions that are higher dimensions than just a binary choice? Great question. That is what we were trying to address in a very different way. So to date, people have looked at addressing this, like getting around just survival, by looking at, say, the change in vitals over time. But there are so many issues around, well, what's a good change? How do you define that? That we scrapped that and instead tackled the problem from, let's look at what actions or decisions are near equivalent with respect to optimizing for just survival, such that now I can say, okay, these actions are near equivalent. Now you can incorporate your own preferences, values, rewards, and select among them based on your own clinical knowledge or based on patient preferences. Because I think there is a lot of complexity in rewards, especially when you look at how they vary across individuals. And I am not yet convinced that we can actually capture that complexity accurately in a reward function.
Yeah, you had a great point there in one of your slides, that data will never basically encode the whole context of the problem. It never, especially what is happening right now, for example. Yep. So yeah, that's a great limitation. So thank you, Jenna, for a great talk and for being here. So I am sure many people will see this recording later. So thank you again.
Great, thanks everyone. Bye-bye.